Man looks at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart.
Before we get through the book of Samuel, though, let me ask you, what kind of a leader do you think the world is looking for at the moment? We live in a time of enormous change and a time of leadership changes and elections. We've had a bit of that last night in Darwin, and we've got the US election coming up in the near future. And so there's all these questions about what kind of a leader do we want? Do we want a strongman leader? Or do we want someone who is perhaps a bit more kind and a bit more listening to the people? Well, who knows? We will see what happens there. But what kind of a leader do you want? What kind of a leader do you think is most important? The people of Israel had their idea of what they wanted in a leader. And it may not have actually fitted with what God wanted in a leader. There's a lesson there for us, and a lesson that we'll pick up as we go through 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel is a great book of the Bible. We're going to spend some time in it through the rest of this year, and certainly into next year. We'll spend a bit of time focusing on Jesus and his birth as we come into December as well. Let's go to chapter 1, and let's look at Hannah and the birth of Samuel. Who is Hannah? Well, Hannah is described for us as the wife of Elkanah. But interestingly, and perhaps disturbingly for us, and a time we won't understand, she is not the only wife of Elkanah. Verse 2 says that he had two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Now, there's not much good that comes from this, and there can be many sermons preached, and probably have been many sermons preached on this passage about the dangers of polygamy and the unhappiness that inevitably arrives from that. And next week we'll spend a bit of time briefly on that, but I don't think that's the main purpose of chapter 1. We learn too that Hannah is unable to conceive. Verse 2 goes on to say Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Read in verse 5 that to Hannah he gave a double portion. We'll come to that. And the Lord, because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. So it's important to note here that we know she couldn't have children, and a reason is that the Lord had closed her womb, but we're given no explanation for that. There's nothing to help us understand why that was the case for her, this loving, godly woman, and yet Peninnah, who comes across as a bit of an unpleasant woman, has children. So there's no explanation given for that. We learn too that she is called, not so much that Hannah is called a rival, but Peninnah is called a rival to Hannah. And here's the danger of polygamy. What a terrible thing to be known as. In verse 6, because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. Now that's annoying when your brothers growing up do that. Or brothers and sisters do that when they're growing up. Provoke each other, to irritate each other. But that this is happening in adult women? This went on year after year. And so here we get an indication that Hannah's longing for a child is not a brief and fleeting thing. It's a long and ongoing experience for her. And her rival would provoke her until she wept and would not eat. We also learn that she is a worshipper of the living God. We see that she would go to the annual sacrifice with her husband Elkanah and make her way there. And we learn that in her time of deep distress, that she went to the house of the Lord to pray. Look at verse 9. Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. And in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Now, I expect that this is not the first time that she has prayed this prayer. Why did the Lord take so long to answer her? What was the reasoning behind God's slowness in responding the way that she wanted and in the way that he eventually does, as we will come to? I don't know. I don't have an answer. Certainly nothing that is immediately satisfying to help me understand why God was slow. Hannah stands as a wonderful example of godliness, of heartache, and of faithful prayer. Well, who is Elkanah then? We know that he is the husband to Hannah, and as we've seen, he is also the husband of Peninnah. And I think we get a hint of the relationship between them all when we look at verse 5. They're at the sacrifice and they're sharing the food. And to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb. Peninnah had his children, but it seems to me that Hannah had his heart. Elkanah too is a worshipper of God, also a servant of God, and if you look in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, from verses 31 to 34, you'll see his name mentioned. There's a few Elkanahs, so I'm pretty sure it's the same bloke. A Levite who was part of the musicians in the house of the Lord. And so Elkanah kind of is this fleeting reference in the book of Samuel. And then we come to the question, well, who is Samuel? Who is this man who this book, Numbers 1 and 2, is named after? Well, we see that he is a child given by God. We've heard Hannah's prayer, her bitter, anguished, weeping prayer. Not bitter, weeping bitterly and anguish. And see how beautifully and yet briefly the birth of Samuel is described, or the conception and birth of Samuel is described. From verse 19, early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. Remember, that was part of her prayer, remember me. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. Samuel, the child given by God, then becomes the child given to God. This was part of her prayer. Lord, if you grant me this request, I will give him to you. And she was faithful to it. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us how the other characters in the story felt about this. We don't know how did Eli feel about having this young child dropped into his care. We don't know really how Elkanah, or I don't fully understand why Elkanah seems so okay with it. But nonetheless, she brought her young son back to the house of the Lord at Shiloh and left him there. And we see at the end of chapter 1, verses 27 and 28, I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. Samuel is also the one that God spoke to. And this becomes important through the rest of the book. That he is the one that God spoke to. The opening verse of chapter 3 sets the scene for us. That the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. Now here is a contrast if you look back in chapter 2. Eli's sons are useless and worthless men. So the contrast is being made between Samuel and these blokes. In those days the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. And so the scene is set for what is about to happen. The rest of the chapter is all about the Lord speaking to Samuel. Now, like us, Samuel wasn't used to hearing the voice of the Lord. So when he heard that voice, he assumed that it was Eli. Eli eventually realized what was happening and sent him back with this instruction: go, lie down, and if he calls you, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And we're in chapter 3 now, and that's at verse 9. And when he heard the Lord again, he responded with the words that we should all learn: "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." There's a couple of key phrases in 1 Samuel that I will be encouraging us to print off, stick on a fridge. This is one of them. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. From here, we see that Samuel became God's representative for the people of Israel, and he was faithful to the Lord. But take note of this. He was the judge, the leader, that nobody asked for. He was just put into that role. Hannah wanted a son and promised he would be given to the Lord, and she did this by taking him to serve the Lord in Shiloh, and there he became that judge that nobody asked for. We come into chapter 8, and here we are introduced further to one of the other main characters in the book of 1 Samuel. His name is Saul. But we learn that the people of Israel are crying out for a new leader. Why? Well, they have a sense that the old system has failed. Now, across the history of the world, there have been movements who would begin with that same motto: the old system has failed, it is time for something new. Sometimes there's truth to that. Sometimes the old system really has completely failed. Sometimes the old system seems to have failed because people have forgotten what the old system actually was and have crowded it with all kinds of other things. But they have this sense that the old system has failed. You see, the ark of God has been captured. God has left the building. We need a king. They look to Eli. Well, Eli's sons are no good. They had no regard for the Lord. They are scoundrels. In fact, they even look to Samuel, and they can say of his sons that they are not following the way of the Lord. We don't want them to be our leader either. And we need someone to lead us. Now, there's some discomfort in chapter 8 about what they're asking for, but if you go back to the end of Judges, which kind of nicely leads into 1 Samuel with a lovely break from the distress in Ruth. But the Judges ends with these words: "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." So maybe it was time for a king. But the tragedy is the language and the reasoning. We want to be like the nations. Well, I'm sure we've all felt like this at times. We want to be like them. Whether it's the Monkey King saying to Mowgli, "I want to be like you." I'm not going to sing it. Or Paul Kelly singing, "I want to be like Billy Baxter." We've all felt it. We want to be like someone else. And so many churches have fallen into that. Wouldn't it be great if we were like one of the other bigger churches? But this is on a much larger scale. And when the old system has failed, it's usual to look around, see what others are doing, and wonder if you could learn from them. This is what the Israelites are doing, but it's exactly what they shouldn't be doing. Because we might say, be yourself. And we might want to say to them, no, be yourself, be true to yourself. This is the simple advice that we give to young people when they're not sure what to do. We can say, just be yourself. Here's a hint. It's not really helpful. And we say that because it means then we don't have to help them anymore. You just be yourself. Don't become my problem. Be yourself. In this case, it is really important because Israel was never meant to be like the other nations. They were to stand apart from them. They were to be different because Yahweh, God, is their king. That God is their leader and they stay faithful to him. Anyway, They ask for a king that they might be like the nations. And God, in his grace, grants their request. This is something that had been mentioned long before. This isn't the first time that we get a mention of a king. We saw that at the end of Judges, and you'll see that even further back. So perhaps now is the time. However, a poor foundation leads to a poor building. And as we read the story of Saul, we see this. They wanted a king so they could be like the other nations. And like the other nations, this king will not have a proper respect of the God who has placed him in that position. So sometimes you get the leaders you deserve. Sometimes you get a poor leader because that's what you actually deserve. And in Saul, there's a couple of situations that make very clear to us that while the story tells us he was chosen by God, he was anointed by Samuel, he was the man for this time, it kind of all went to his head. In chapter 14, we see that he made a vow. They're chasing the Philistines. They're at war. They're wiping them out. And Saul, for whatever reason, makes this vow, this oath. Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food, and the beginning of verse 24 says they were in distress that day because of that oath. Now Jonathan didn't know about that vow, and he was the only one who was refreshed by eating something. But the king had made this oath, this vow, and God had honoured this vow, and the people were distressed. So when Saul looked to God for guidance, God was silent. A vow had been broken. We learn too that jealousy affects everyone. We're going to talk about King David, and as you read through the book of Samuel, you'll see the importance of David, and in 2 Samuel, you'll really see the importance of David. But the relationship between Saul and David, while it has some very high points, when it turns bad, it turns really bad. And we see that in chapter 18. David's returning from a battle, victorious. The ladies of the town are out, they're dancing and they're singing. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And Saul, because he's a bit of a sookie lala, is upset by this. They've credited David with tens of thousands, but me with only thousands. What more can he want but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. Now, an interesting phrase. He kept a close eye on David, not because he cared for him, but because he didn't trust him anymore. So be careful when you're looking for a leader. Are you keeping in line with God's revealed will? Or are you just trying to make things easier for yourself? Are you looking for someone who is tall and handsome like Saul? Or someone who is a person after God's own heart? The king they wanted was not the king they needed. So go to chapter 16 and we'll see the kind of person who is the king that they need. We've heard from chapter 16 already. Please open your Bibles up again to that. Now Saul noted earlier that he came from the least of the clans of Benjamin, the smallest of the tribes. And the end of Judges helps us to see why it's the smallest of the tribes. It would have been an unusual destination for a king to come from, but there is a pattern here that we see in this book. That God takes the small and makes them large. He takes the weak and makes them strong. So there is this pattern forming. It's not the tall, good-looking one who is to be chosen. You see, Samuel goes to Bethlehem. He sees the sons of Jesse, and they're brought out to him. And Samuel sees Eliab, the first son, and says to himself, he's the one. He's tall, he looks good, he'll look good in a suit, he's got an MBA, he could be the next bachelor. Surely people will follow him. But Samuel is working in the wrong order. Instead of waiting to hear God say, this one, he needs God to say to him, no, not this one. And then we come to what I think is the key statement for understanding this whole book in verse 7. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now here's the dilemma for us when we are voting for a political leader. All we really see is the outward appearances. We don't really get to see the heart. That all becomes apparent when they're in office or when they are out of office and have written their biography, or someone's written a biography about them, and then we find out what their heart really was like. Bitter and calloused and selfish and corrupt, which is happening in Nigeria at the moment, or that they really do have a great, deep, yearning passion and care for the people that they are responsible for. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. There's a verse to print out and stick on your fridge. You see, it's the humble one. And so David is the king that nobody has asked for. There are a lot of comparisons in the Bible, and here we can compare these two men, Saul and David. Both of them will be known as kings of Israel. Both will lead the armies into battle, and both will win great battles. But there are some significant differences between them both. We'll spend more time on this as we go. But here's an important one. Saul is appointed. See, in verse 22 of chapter 8, God says to Samuel, listen to them and give them a king. But in chapter 16 and verse 1, and it's a little clearer in the English Standard Version, that translation, we see that David is chosen. The Lord said to Samuel, I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. You see the difference? Listen to them and give them a king, or I have provided for myself a king from among his sons. He is the king they need, and Saul will not be happy about this. And so, like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, he might say of him, is my kingship now to be prevented by the upstart pretensions of a young man without family connections or fortune? Is this to be endured? It shall not be. But it shall be, for he is the king they needed. He is a man after God's own heart. Centuries later, the ordaining of David was described like this in Acts 13. After removing Saul, God made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Now 1 Samuel chapter 12, particularly verses 13 and 14, tell us that the kingship was about following Yahweh and involved submitting to his commandments. Here's an important thing to understand and why the king of Israel should never be like the king of other nations. The king of other nations is the king, the lawmaker. The king of Israel is not. He is under God. Always and forever, the king is a servant first. So David becomes the king they needed. And here's the heartache. David wasn't perfect. And if you read into 2 Samuel, you'll see that he wasn't really good as a father. And then he made a huge mistake with Bathsheba. And while he may have been forgiven, the consequences of his family relationships never left him. Now, I mentioned earlier that a poor building or a poor foundation leads to a poor building. A solid foundation, therefore, can lead to a much more solid building. And one of the commentators I read this week made this comment, which I thought was lovely. That the security of David's throne, let me start that again. The security of David's throne will rest on the solid foundation of God's promises, not on David's performance. That is what will make his reign so very different from Saul's. It will rest on the solid foundation of God's promises. Now, the summary of 1 Samuel is found in 16 and verse 7. Chapter 16 and verse 7. The Lord looks at the heart. This is in fact a key statement through the whole Bible, which reminds us that this book of Samuel doesn't stand alone. So here's a brief summary of the whole Bible. The story begins with the creation, where God makes everything, and it is finally, in its final creation, it is described as being very good. It's wonderful. And it all looks great. And then we come to chapter 3 of Genesis and we see sin enters the world. And so this beautiful, very good world is broken. There are cracks appearing. There are thorns appearing. There is pain in childbirth. There is heartache. And from there on, we begin to see the slow journey up, the slow revealing of God's plan of his salvation. We see the chosen ones. We see Joseph. They go into Egypt. They come out of Egypt. God is being faithful to them. He brings them out. He restores them. He cares for them. They come into the promised land. They are winning their battles. Things are going well. We come to this time where this time in 1st and 2nd Samuel are the great times. They're the glory times. But something cracks along the way. And so the kingdom fails. They're exiled. There's prophets that keep telling them, this is how we should live. But all along the way is a hint of something that is yet to come. And then we come into the New Testament. And we see there the birth of Jesus. And we recognize here that everything that the Old Testament has been pointing to is finally being fulfilled. And in the birth and in the life, in the teaching, and in the death and resurrection of Jesus, everything we see in the Old Testament comes to pass. And now, like the Old Testament, what we read in the New Testament leads us to understand that we have everything, but there is something yet to come. So we come back to Jesus, the center of history, the central character of the Bible, and we realize that he is the king we need. And here the pattern continues, because we can ask the question, well, who is he? And where does he come from? He has no palace. He has no family connections or fortune. He has a questionable birth in a back town of Judea. But looking ahead to this time, and even looking ahead to this time, Isaiah wrote of him words like this: he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Is this our king? Is this to be endured? Ralph Davis in his commentary says this: the folks at home said, he's just one of us. Others complained, he has too much fun. And still others objected, he's not from the right place. But the clincher for many was this: Messiahs don't suffer. And what clout did this opinion pack? None. He is the king that we need. He is the only king that we need. He is certainly the king that people didn't ask for. Well, for sure, they did long for a Messiah, but they wanted Saul, the man who was head and shoulders above the rest. They wanted Judas Maccabeus, the great warrior king. They wanted the strong man, not the boy shepherd, which leaves us asking, what king do we want? What kind of leader do we want to follow? Today's been an introduction and an overview of 1 Samuel. And I'd urge you and encourage you to read through it during the week, or to get onto Bible Gateway, look up the NIV UK and listen to David Suchet read it for you. See what stands out for you in this story. There's a strong chance you'll be familiar with some of the stories. And as we walk through 1 Samuel together, you might have some of your assumptions challenged about those stories. But most importantly, don't see 1 Samuel as a complete story. It is some early and important chapters in a much larger book. And while this book might have a beginning, a middle, and an end, there is much more to come. Here we read about the establishment of a king and the building of a kingdom. And from that we will hear of the building of the kingdom of God and hear again and again that Jesus is good news for you and for our community. He is our leader.